All right, I want to discuss chapter 2. Um, and the really cool thing about this chapter is it gives us an opportunity to look at how each of us is affected by uh, what we absolutely don't really have any choice about, and that is genetics and pre birth development. Now, let me start all this by saying that as far as psychology is concerned, especially developmental psychology, you'll see that our perspective is politically incorrect. In other words, we're seeing how we as human beings are largely shaped, or shaped at least to some degree, by what happens before we are born. So, if you're one of those folks who likes to think that life begins when you're born, then you might find some of this, you might find some of this offensive. You might find some of this really hard to deal with. But the truth is, for developmental psychologists, we are interested in human development right back to the beginning, which is conception, and sort of before conception too, because we are creatures of creatures. Sorry, that's really politically incorrect. We are life forms that have genetics. We have genes. Toward that end, we are shaped by the combination of mother and father, biological mother and father. Usually when I use the terms mother and father, I'll really mean the people who are functioning in that way in your life. But here I'm saying biological mother and father, as in the people who contribute the chromosomes that come together to make your genetics. And so in this chapter you read a lot about the mechanisms of heredity. What does that mean? What is heredity? What are genetics? What are genes? We have 46 chromosomes, each of us. We have 23 chromosomes from each of our parents. Whether you like your parents, whether you know your parents, whether you've ever met your parents, they contributed the genetic material that led to, at least theoretically, who you are. Okay, now there'll be a lot of who you are that is completely due to your life choices, but suffice to say, what we start off with a template of who you are, genetically at least. So consequently, you're going to see there's we're introducing you to the concept of the genotype, which is what your genes tell you about who you are, versus the phenotype, which is the interaction between your genetics and your environment, how the environment affects the way those genes are expressed. All of us have some I guess negative genetic effects, you could call, or genetic disorders. All of us in our genes have some diseases or some weaknesses or whatever. The good thing is you also see that you'll have some strengths. So you are a combination of your strengths and weaknesses genetically. That's okay. That's cool. That gives us a little genetic diversity. I think one way I like to look at it is, instead of genes being the plan and you being the building that's built on that plan, let's look at it as your genes are like a wall full of little light switches, and the environment comes in to these light switches and turns some of them on and some of them off. So genes are theoretically how you're going to be. Your phenotype, who you really are, is the result of the life experiences, and that starts all the way back to conception. Your life experiences that affect all this. So a good portion of this chapter is purely biological. You'll track through the the 40 weeks, theoretically, the 40 weeks of in utero development, both genetically and as far as physically. As far as developmental psychology, we're interested in people and what makes folks who they are. And toward that end, we want to see in that in utero development the environmental effects. One of the most important, and I think this is what you're going to hear from me a great deal this semester, is how we form relationships with one another. Okay, so part of who you are, part of the shaping of who you are, both biologically, socioculturally, cognitively, psychologically, part of all of that is shaped from the very beginning with your interaction with your parents, how they felt about you. Okay, now this is a science that we're just now really beginning to understand. The parent who foresees that and wants this child is having a different biological, psychological, and cultural effect on that child than the parent who doesn't anticipate the child or doesn't anticipate or desire to have that child. Okay, there's a biological effect. There's hormones that matter there. Okay, toward this end, now I'm going to say this, you'll probably laugh or chuckle, but one of my observations of people is that to a certain degree, I think that most people don't really know where babies come from. Okay, now the reason I say that is because I've met a lot of people who seem to take this baby coming kind of thing almost like a stork dropped the baby on the doorstep one day. Okay, folks who use terms like, well, I didn't mean to have children, but it was an accident, which is ironic. An accident is like when you walk out of your house and you slip on the ice on the sidewalk, but you don't hear people say, yes, I slipped on the sidewalk, fell down, and got pregnant. But you do hear people say, well, it was an accident. No, it wasn't an accident. Okay, there is a biological cause for the production of a child. Okay, whether you realize what all the machinery is for, that sexual act is specifically designed to produce children. Okay, each and every time. So that's where babies come from. Now, consequently, that affects development, the human developmental psychology, because probably most of us weren't really anticipated. After a certain degree, we probably were anticipated, but not initially. And toward that end, that has a lot to do with our human diversity. Do people want me? Did they set out to bring me about? Probably not. There is something to developmental psychology that is a part of that. Okay, something else that we're going to see, because we're looking at how people are formed, you're also going to see in this chapter discussion on something called teratogens, which are all of the different environmental effects that cause birth defects. Teratogens are always negative, they're not positive. Okay, so that's, the stuff like drinking the lead in the water, or inhaling smoke, or when you get drunk a lot, when you carry a child, and also things like stress. Stress affects the developing child. Every time, stress affects the developing child. Now, I'm not saying be careful of lead in the water and radiation in the atmosphere just to stress you out, because that wouldn't be helpful, would it? But all of these things matter. Now, Now, consequently, toward that, you're going to let me pull something out of the chapter here. With teratogens, we are looking at the depth of the effect, when it happens, when exposure happens, because you expose the infant at 2 days after conception, there's a different effect than if you expose the child to that teratogen at 8 months. Okay, because it's a different part of the development. So pay attention to that. Finally, let me just give you a little bit at the end of the chapter where we're going. Note the differences in the different procedures of labor and delivery. I think that if I could pull one thing out, this is probably the first real interactions between parent and child, is the choices that the parent goes through or makes dealing with how the child's born. The interaction between parent and child there, this is the first time that there's this real tangible relationship developed. I know people tend to say, well, we're all individuals and none of us really affect one another. And that's not true. You are greatly affected by in your first year, your first 2 years, by this interaction between parent and child. You are. We all are. We're coming back to that as we go through when we talk about things like attachment and trust and stuff like that. Okay. Well, that's about it for the second chapter. I hope you have a wonderful week and enjoy reading and doing all the exercises and all. And take it easy. Take care of yourselves.